Good evening, everyone. I'm Dwayne Johnson Cochran, the chairman of the Genre Committee of the Writers Guild of America West. And I'm so happy you all could be here today for our next panel discussion. It's going to be about superheroes. And we are really excited to have a really great lineup of people who are going to be talking about the genre of TV and film, the medium of genre storytelling, whether or not it's genre or medium. We have a really great panel of people, and but first, I'll introduce you to my vice chair, Kelly Jo Brick. Kelly Jo.
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out. I'd like to also send a huge thank you to our panelists today for sharing their time and experiences with us. Also to the subcommittee who helped bring the event together, and to Greg, our guild liaison, who's just always amazing in how he helps us. I'd like to invite you to our next genre committee meetings where we plan all these events and we get to know our fellow genre writers. That's coming up on Tuesday, the first Tuesday in December. Also, for spooky month for Halloween, we have Nightmare on Our Street, social commentary in modern horror. That event is coming up virtually on Wednesday, October 27th. So we'd love to have you there as well. And back to Dwayne.
We're going to have another genre committee meeting. I think it's the last one of the year. Kelly Jo, I think it's going to be in December, right?
Yep. The first Tuesday, December.
So please follow your WGA emails, and you can come to that if you want to join the genre committee. Okay, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Elliott David, who will be our monitor for this panel tonight. And take it away, Elliott.
Thanks, Dwayne. Thanks, Kelly Jo. Yeah, also special thanks to Greg Mitchell, who was really helped put this whole thing together. My name is Elliott David. I am a member of the Writers Guild, and I am a fan of superhero stories, just like everyone else on the entire planet, because it is the dominant global form of entertainment. But is it a genre? Or are superhero stories a medium through which genres can be explored and experimented and combined? Buddy comedy, spy thriller, family drama, or etc. Spoiler alert, yes. But with us to discuss this are the writers and showrunners behind some of the most exciting and inventive superhero stories in film and television, to talk about the inspirations behind their work and genre storytelling in general. And they are Jac Shaeffer, showrunner of WandaVision and writer of Black Widow; Dave Callaham, the screenwriter of Wonder Woman 84 and Shang-Chi, and working on Spider-Verse 2. Eric Kripke, showrunner of The Boys; Cheo Hodari Coker, showrunner of Luke Cage; Michael Waldron, showrunner of Loki, writer of Doctor Strange 2, and Rick and Morty, who's doing some of the most brilliant subverting of genre tropes, and I guess you could kind of come down to superheroes almost. And Salim Akil, the showrunner of Black Lightning, which just finished its 4th and final season. Thank you guys and lady all so much for being here. I think I would love to start with Jac, because WandaVision so brilliantly told these very intimate character stories through multiple decades of styles of television, and it just worked so perfectly. So Jac, if you want to tell us about how initially you came on and went down that road, and then the type of genre research that you did to sort of break story.
Sure. Yeah. So I came on that project. It was an idea that Kevin Feige had to combine Wanda and Vision and their MCU storylines and also their comic history with the history of the American sitcom, which is like totally obvious, right? Like obviously those things go together super well. And they had that as a concept, and they had sort of a big sort of kitchen sink of ideas. And I came on and had an idea for a shape and a way to sort of a non-linear way in of sort of starting inside the world, inside the sitcoms, and kind of drawing out the mystery of what's really going on. And is it something being done to Wanda? Is it something that she's doing? And then kind of blowing it all open. And yeah, I mean, the entire experience was about tropes. Like we had huge trope lists, both for sitcoms, obviously, and all of that goodness, but then also like the tropes of, the research facility and the scientific anomaly, and like it's a bubble, and like who are the experts that are brought in, and it was a constant play of all of those things, which is like luckily I've spent the entirety of my life consuming that material, and being a fan, and delighting in the times when I'm surprised. And so that's what we tried to do, is we tried to sort of like digest and regurgitate all of these tropes and then organize it in a way that would be delightful for fans and also accessible to non-fans. I don't know if there was a question in there, Elliott, but that was my best attempt.
Yeah, I mean, that's really it, is this idea of filtering various genres or styles through the superhero medium, as it were, as opposed to, because it's so often referred to as, subverting the superhero genre, when that's not really what it is. It's more like I said, like a medium through which you can do these genres. And when they first came to you, just as you're breaking these stories and like we said, subverting these tropes, were you just, rewatching old, Mary Tyler Moore? Were you in Modern Family and that whole process with the writers and breaking the story?
That's what we did. Is it was a lot of the home base was the Dick Van Dyke Show, because that was the show that was on forever and was hilarious forever, and can like set the tone for sitcoms that feel authentic and feel like sexy and fun and aspirational, but not like entirely closed off. Like there's a little bit of where you can kind of recognize yourself, even though it's so stylized. And we wanted their love story to feel really kind of effervescent. So we started there and we studied there. And of course we looked at everything else. But then when I assigned episodes, whatever episode they had, they were assigned the task of becoming an expert in their particular era. So that was one of the things. And then at the same time, we were watching Annihilation and, like other sort of examples of that, like the much sort of harder sci-fi where there's an incident like this. And trying to find sort of intersections.
And did you come into it with a superhero background? What was your feeling coming into it? And then as you tried to put these characters in this situation, like how did that come about?
Yeah, so I wasn't really a comic person before starting at Marvel. Prior to this job, I had worked for about a year on Black Widow. So I had gotten like an incredible crash course in comics and also sort of the Marvel way. And so I brought all of that education to WandaVision. But, as a young person, like as a teenager, really, like the movies that I loved, it was like the Terminator. Well, I was going to say franchise. It was the first two Terminator movies, and like Ripley. So I was like looking at like Sarah Connor and Ripley, and like even like Lilu in The Fifth Element. Like I was like trying to find all the ladies in the genre space, and I think I brought that to the superhero space. Like that was sort of my way in. Is I've always loved action. And the work that I'd done prior to this was always very sort of like the intersection of like my lady perspective and like my enjoyment of like rom-coms and my enjoyment of like female-led stories with action and with sort of speculative fiction type ideas. So yeah, and like Trinity and the Matrix, like that, I feel like all of that is applicable to the superhero space because it's so malleable right now. Like you can kind of get any shadings you want out of a superhero story, depending on what you want to apply. That was a really vague sentence, but I'm going to stop there.
But then also with Black Widow, how much of that was about, like I said, again, the character-driven story, but also giving it that sort of spy thriller, which like one of the most interesting things too is I find with superhero stories is that it's really the character predicates the genre rather than vice versa, which is usually the case. Here's the genre that I'm writing in, and here are the characters that exist within it. And instead, you're sort of taking the character first and saying, what is this genre that this character story is best told through? Sort of with, I guess, legacy characters, this kind of thing. But how much was the idea of the spy thriller family drama that Black Widow really became when you were breaking it and working on it earlier on?
Yeah, I mean, it sort of felt like it needed to be some kind of a spy thriller because, right, she's like her deals. She's the super spy. But it started because I thought, first of all, just let me say, just because of this is a community of writers, I was one of several writers on Black Widow, very talented people. But I in my early days of breaking the story, I was really fixated on this idea of why doesn't Widow have an accent? Like for some reason that really, and I had this vision of her as like an 11-year-old at a soccer game in like Ohio. And that opening sequence of the movie was built from that, of like, what if she was part of a cover family, part of a family of Russian spies, and how like, because she clearly in the MCU prior to her standalone movie, she clearly loves the Avengers and loves America and loves the Western world. And it felt like it would be really exciting to sort of see where that came from, that she's this like consummate liar and spy, and you can never really know what she's really thinking, but that there's always like heart underneath that. So the idea that it started with her placement with a fake family when she was at an age that was so formative, that the question of like, how much is it fake and how much of it is it real, that just seemed really juicy and fun for her.
That's great. Dave, I want to ask you, you sort of had a massive year, superhero year, with Shang-Chi and Wonder Woman 84. How you feel about this idea of genre and superhero stories, and how you approached with Shang-Chi, which I imagine there was a lot of inspiration coming from a lot of different films and stories, and then also Wonder Woman, which is a bit harder to pin down.
Yeah, it is. First, I just want to say hi to everybody. I didn't really say anything in our fake green room, but hello. I'm a big fan of a lot of the work here. This is a very kick-ass panel, and I'm very humbled to be here. So thank you all for letting me listen to you. Well, Shang-Chi is more recent in terms of when we made it and released, so it's a little fresher for me since I've been talking about it a lot. That movie is obviously really important to me and to a lot of people as the first Marvel movie to feature like a predominantly Asian cast and to feature a mostly Asian lead. So the genres that we knew we were headed for were pretty defined right out of the gate, because Shang-Chi, though we jettisoned a huge percentage of the publication history because it's deeply problematic, we did know that we wanted to make some sort of martial arts movie. It was just, wouldn't it be cool to see what a Marvel martial arts movie would look like? And so that can still mean an awful lot of things, and we allowed it to mean anything we wanted it to be. So we went into the genre in every direction and watched, 36 Chambers, and more recently something like Crouching Tiger, all the way to a Kung Fu Hustle, which is a more comedic martial arts film that a lot of people don't know, but which is awesome. And we just sort of picked and chose, but like Jack said, and I'm sure like Michael's experience too, we were still making a Marvel movie, and so you're always sort of shading inside of that. And so for us, it was just about how do we play by the rules of a Marvel movie, but do something really unique and different. Interestingly, maybe not interesting, I don't know. Jack had mentioned that they had a bunch of tropes that they were interested in exploring and exploding. On Shang-Chi, we had a list of tropes, but they weren't superhero tropes. They were tropes about Asian people that we found really offensive, that had been perpetuated in a lot of Western media for a very long time. And so that's really where we were headed with trying to blow things up and trying to change perspectives.
Yeah, do you feel, obviously in that place, it just provides like a really horrible context from which you can change things, especially on such a massive scale with that. But you know, and as we go through, the idea of really tropes and viewer savviness is something that I want to get to as well, because we're living in a time when not only are these superhero stories themselves really pushing the boundaries of TV and film storytelling in a certain way, but you can sort of a lot of the legwork is done. Like you don't have to explain as much to get to a certain point. I mean, you know, for example, there's no, you know, the current Spider-Man had no origin, and people are just like, yeah, I know, like, we can get to it, you know. That's really incredible. And so tell me a bit, and I know that this is probably going to be the case for a lot of the Marvel properties when talking about how genre was decided. It's going to be, well, Kevin Feige told us that that's what it was, you know. But it's such a fun playground to get in and research and look around and see what like new ideas you can come with. But how was I know Wonder Woman, you said, you know, isn't as fresh in your mind. And I know you obviously can't really say much about Into the Spider-Verse, but how was it different with those places on, especially with those titles, especially Wonder Woman 84 coming off this sequel? What place in existing in such a, you know, such less consistent tone of other DC films, you know? I'd say complimentary.
Wonder Woman is a hard one to reference for me, because what happened on that movie, basically for me, was I had worked with Patty previously on an independent feature that didn't get made. She jumped off it to make the first Wonder Woman movie and left me crying in the dirt for 4 years. And then she came back and flew back into my life in a golden plane and said, I want you to come with me and write on the writing team of the sequel. And I said, yes, without hearing the idea. And then she told me the whole movie that she had in her head and told me it was going to be in the 80s. And she really wanted it to sort of feel like a Richard Donner movie. And so I kind of jumped into something that had been pretty well decided internally already. And she just wanted me to help her write it. And so I did. And on Spider-Verse, I mean, I don't even know what to say about that, because I've been doing that for 4 years. I don't know how many of you, I know Michael obviously has worked in animation. Animation's a nightmare. I strongly recommend never doing it, and it'll eat your life. And I've lost all sense of what we're doing and how it works, but I'm working with Lord and Miller, and they have a really good sense of that world. But I think, as you can imagine, the world of something like that the goal seems to be, how much crazy can we fit into this thing, which they did pretty well with the first one. But then, you know, we're about to live in a world where live action Spider-Man movies have 1 billion spider people. So now we feel the need to amp up the ante. So it's a bizarre arms race of spider people, basically. I don't think I answered anything that you asked.
I loved it. I still loved it. Salim, so Black Lightning just wrapped its 4th and final season. I wanted to ask you, same thing. How do you feel about telling stories, getting voices through the superhero medium, as it were, and also the process of coming onto that, of you being a Black Lightning fan to begin with, and what sort of genre you feel like you were really embodying through that, and also existing within this larger Berlanti-verse and that whole dance.
Yeah, I you know, luckily I didn't feel the need to fit into a Berlanti verse. I had a very clear idea of what I wanted to do with the characters and what I wanted to say with the characters. So it really, we were really sort of like an island. You know, we were, the great thing about working with Greg is he doesn't really, in my case, he really didn't have a lot to say. He just said, you know, do what you feel is best. I think I was blessed in the sense that the only other show in this genre about an African-American superhero was Cheo's at the time. And I was watching that very, very closely because I knew Cheo was going to do some amazing things with it. And I didn't want to step on anything that he had already done. For me, it was more about sort of illuminating the culture of African Americans, the culture of anyone that was in our purview. So at each point, I tried to honor that idea. If, you know, we had a very strong woman, and I like to say womanist, we had a very strong womanist presence on our show with the mom and the two daughters who surrounded this man. And so it was really not so much concentrating on genre. I had to be reminded several times by my right-hand man, Charles Holland, that we were actually writing a superhero show and they had to use their powers, because I was really trying to write a family drama. And so what we would do is we would write these stories out, or we would come up with these stories, and then we would figure out how do we insert the ideas of these people being special with powers. And so that was challenging in a very beautifully schizophrenic way, because we were allowed to, and we did, take it to a point where we decided, and you have to remember when we did the show, there was a lot of things going on in the country, a lot of things going on in the African American community, in the Asian community, in the Latin community, that was not appropriate. You know, that's an understatement, of course. And I decided very early on that I was going to use this platform that we had to explore those issues through the eyes of folk who had powers where they could just take over, right? They could just take over and you know, put their will onto the general public, but they were, for lack of a better term, moral people who were trying to be as so-called normal as they could. So the first episode of the first season, I mean, I think in the first 5 or 10 minutes, you see Jefferson being pulled over by the police and with straining his power in order to, in his mind, save his children. But really what that was the idea of how many African-American men and women and brown men and women and Asian men and women, how many have to subdue their power of intelligence, their power of speak, their power of maybe even who they are, you know, maybe who they are. You're a lawyer or a doctor, but you have to subdue that power in the framework of state sponsored violence in order to live. And so I really wanted to explore this genre in the sense of, what is it? What does a Black man, a Black woman, an Asian woman have to do, a Latin man have to do in order to live in this society and not always exhibit your power? Because power in a fake universe is one thing. Power that you feel in real life is a dangerous thing. You can get pulled over by the police or whatever situation you're in, and as a human being, you feel your power as a human being, but you have to subdue it in order to live. And so in the outset, that's how we wanted to subvert the idea of a superhero and what it actually means to be a superhero. And so that was the approach. Like the others, I don't think I answered your question, but
no, absolutely. And it's a really interesting approach, because one thing that I was thinking about talking about is something that all these stories have in common is superpowers, obviously, right? And how does that factor in? How do you approach writing about power? Does it shift from genre? Like a person that has power in a horror movie might be different than a person that has power in a spy thriller, and approaching from that. But what I think is really powerful about what you said, no horrible pun intended, is about the subjugation of Black Americans having to subdue their power, and what happens when one is given literal superpowers, and how they have to quiet that in themselves. When can you showcase your power, and when can you keep it? When do you have to keep it within?
Yeah, because so many of us as human beings, we know the power that we have inside of us, and we know the logic in which we can sort of attack, that's the wrong word, but attack the nonsense that is out there when these things happen. But we also have that moment in life where we know that even our logic, even our plain, simple logic that makes all the sense in the world in those moments don't make sense to the people who have the power over us. And so we have to swallow it. And I really was interested in following a character until the end who got more and more depressed about it. And so, and if you look at Black Lightning, he really did. He just got more and more depressed about having these powers and not being able to use them as freely as maybe Gamby, would have wanted him to, or as freely as most people would have wanted him to. But he had a sort of moral compass that he never wanted to stray too far away from being just your basic human being and playing by those rules. I think the only times that he really stepped outside of himself in that regard was when it came to his children, when it came to his community, and when it came to the people that he sincerely loved. So for us, to go back to your question about the Berlanti universe, for us, we were, no pun intended, we were the black sheep of the family. We didn't have sexy guys that were in their 20s running around in tights. We had an old guy whose knees hurt, and when he who got hurt, and his family got hurt, and he was a man who was supremely concerned about his family and how this ultra violence was affecting them. And that's the other thing that we never ran away from, I hope, on Black Lightning, is that we never ran away from the result and the effects of violence. I always tried to make sure that we understood what violence means to a community and how it affects the entire community. I grew up in a community where there was violence all the time, and it affects the children, it affects the parents, it affects everybody that lives in that community in different ways. And I never wanted to cheapen that.
That's amazing. Cheo, obviously you had very similar themes in your approach to violence and to empowerment with Luke Cage, who has a complicated history in both the comics, and the character, as you presented him, had a very conflicted feeling with his own powers, and also just the parallels between the Luke Cage story and the Captain America story, right? Where one person is this celebrated, patriotic mascot, and the other is subjugated and imprisoned. And I'd love to hear about how you similarly approach these kind of stuff.
Okay. I'm kind of overwhelmed because being fans of everybody here, so I'm just really thrilled and a little nervous about being on the panel, because I'm just like, man, it's like I could literally listen to everybody talk about their shows and want to follow up and get, deep into it. To kind of hit the question, it's a lot of things, honestly, with Luke Cage. Even down to, even though this isn't part of your question, but it kind of filters into your question, the notion of bulletproof blackness. So, for example, I remember we were prepping episode 6, and it was a scene where Luke Cage walks into this boxing gym, and the people there pull out their guns and they start shooting at him. And I remember we're in the middle of this production meeting, and, Jeff Loeb was saying, like, Jeff Loeb was, in terms of Marvel Television, was our Kevin Feige, just in terms of being, the major domo in terms of charge of all the different shows. And he was saying, can we do something different? Because why would they pull out their guns? Because you figure by the 6th episode, everybody knows that he's bulletproof. So why would they even try to shoot him? And I remember saying, Jeff, I will never get tired of seeing a bulletproof black man. And, there's just something about, with so many people, so many of my heroes, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Medgar Evers, on the political front, or even on the hip hop front, personal friend of mine like the Notorious B.I.G. or Tupac, with so many black people that weren't bulletproof. Even seeing a character with that which would be like a level 1 superhero power, there's something thrilling when you put that within the social, construct and concept of a show. And so, that was the thing about Luke Cage, was that the little things and the big things, acknowledging a real New York and real hip hop and real culture, at the same time, having somebody that could, do things, and then how that affects the genre, just in terms of, like, what is it like having a character that is burdened by being a superhero, not burdened by being black. What I mean by that is, there's this old Paul Mooney joke where he said he only wanted to be black on nights and weekends because it's entirely too stressful, and I thought about that for Luke Cage, because, what makes him different on top of everything else is that, he's, other than hiding his real name, Carl Lucas, but for the most part, where to find Luke Cage. He doesn't wear a mask. You go to the barbershop and you can kind of come to him with your issues. And so a lot of the show was about, how does somebody bulletproof in a neighborhood affect the ecology of that neighborhood, with both the police and also with the criminal power. Because the thing that's really interesting about, it doesn't matter what city, like, say, for example, even a city like Atlanta, it's like the same people you see in the strip club on Saturday, you're going to see in church on Sunday. You're going to run into killers at the grocery store. There are these different rules, and you have all these things subverted on top of everything else. And so when you're a superhero, how does that work? And in a place like Harlem, my grandfather grew up in Harlem, and he would talk about, like, you could be on 120 on Lenox Avenue, and you could you would see Duke Ellington. You would see, all these people that choose records or movies or all these different black superstars were just in the neighborhood walking around. And so I thought, look, what if we did a superhero version of that, just taking from, Luke Cage himself and the character, the history of the comics, but then on top of everything else, if you want to deal with some of the other issues, okay, he's wrongfully accused, he's wrongfully imprisoned, and then breaks himself out of prison. And then if you want to kind of relate how that deals with, Falcon and Winter Soldier, the fact that both Winter Soldier and Falcon were, experimented on and how that was different. I mean, without getting deep into a wormhole of all the different stories and things like that, there are constantly a lot of things that, even if you're telling a straightforward superhero story, if you inject it with culture, I mean, this is one of the things that David touched on, is that you're going to have a responsibility, or not really responsibility, you have the ability and the opportunity to, rather than avoid what people are thinking or what people would think about something, you can, talk about it. You can deal with it within the story that you're telling. And then to kind of go for the bigger question that you asked, whether or not, superhero stories are a medium rather than a genre, I would lean more towards medium, because comic books in general have always told complicated stories, through symbolism. And you can go all the way back to, Superman or Captain America, characters that were created by Jewish American writers, and using, the metaphor of being different and having powers from what they felt in terms of alienation, being in the minority in the country, and also being a hunted minority. One of the things that's really interesting about the X-Men is that, even a lot of people have already talked about it, like how with the different stories you're able to kind of explore at the time, Martin Luther King's perspective through Xavier, as opposed to the Malcolm X perspective of Magneto. The comic books in general have always had the ability to talk about a lot of different things, even though it's supposed to be, dismissively funny papers, but really, depending on who's writing, Chris Claremont or Frank Miller or any number of people, you can do anything you want, and you can tell any story you want, and you can go in any direction you want. And I think that's really, particularly on this panel, all of us have had the ability and have used that ability to really tell, I think, stories that deepen the human condition.
That's great. And I absolutely agree with you about all the incredible stories that everyone here has told them. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about, because it is just, I mean, as I came from a world of music journalism and arts journalism as well, and I'm, just obviously a big fan of all the incredible work you've done. Coming at Luke Cage from this genre place that we're talking about, of if it's and I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but I heard you reference this to someone before, of using blaxploitation as an entry point, but also The Godfather, also like Flow, your own sort of like personal type of stories that you wanted to write as a screenwriter. How did you bring that history of like Biggie, Bob Marley, the Wu-Tang Clan, the original Avengers, like how did you bring that into Luke Cage when you were doing research, when you were breaking story, when you were referencing things from a visual and a screenwriting, especially since it's the Guild standpoint?
Well, culture is the cheapest special effect. It's like if you lean into culture and you're showing people sides of the universal human condition in ways that they haven't seen it before, you can end up hitting a nerve where everybody all of a sudden responds to it. Right now, Squid Game, is proof positive of that. In the case of Luke Cage, for me, it was like even down to the way that I pitched the show. When I finally got to the meeting, it's almost like a video game. You get through levels of meetings, so you finally get to the actual room, and it's like, okay, if I say the right things, maybe I'll get the job. If not, you get that smile and thank you very much. You get shuffled off to the side. You almost feel like Sandman in the corner rubbing the wooden log before you go in. But thing is like what I said was my vision of Luke Cage is City of God meets Belly as written by the staff of The Wire. And what in a weird way got me the job was that, and I didn't know this at the time, was that Jeff Lowe was really tight with Hype Williams, who directed the movie Belly. And so he was really shocked at why I cited Belly as an influence. But that was the thing was, you have a New York based character that's coming from the street, and using the hip hop aesthetic. But then at the same time, I've also saw Luke Cage more as a Western. And then if you want to kind of call blaxploitation, for me, I don't see blaxploitation as an insult in terms of, as a genre, because, well, for one, it's personal for me because my uncle, Richard Wesley, wrote Uptown Saturday Night and Let's Do It Again. But the other part of that is that all blaxploitation really is Black heroes empowered with the ability to do the same thing as their white counterparts. If you look at the poster of Shaft, it says hotter than Bond, cooler than Bullet. And okay, what's in common with that? Okay, Bond is a theme song. Shaft is a theme song. Bullet has a car. Well, Shaft didn't have a car, but he's easy on the eyes. And so it's really the same thing. It's James Bond with a leather coat. It's all the different trappings of that. And so it's kind of the same thing, even in a comic book drama. That was one of the things that for me was really interesting. And that was what was so cool about the fact that we were finally in a time where all these different stories could be told, where one doesn't cancel the other one out. So, for example, while Salim thank you, for saying that how much, Luke Cage, existed while you were building. At the same time, people were like, they always try to pit us against each other. Like, what do you think of Black Lightning? Or what do you think of Luke Cage? And the answer that I said was absolutely true, which is that I'm happy that we're in a time where both can exist without canceling each other out. Both can exist where you can be fans of both, because we've constantly been in situations where it's like Highlander, there can only be one, that's kind of the difference between, our generation. And I think sometimes the younger generation, particularly now, in terms of African-American creators, I don't think they take it for granted. But back in the day, there was so much of a rivalry between John Singleton and the Hughes brothers. And from the standpoint of, it felt like at the time in the 90s that you could only have one superstar, as opposed to now where there are just so many things and people being interested in so many different stories. If you look at the diversity of this panel, it's like, the only thing that matters ultimately is green, and you're going to see more green if you have different colors of people and different cultures and, together telling stories. And I think that's really the biggest thing, because if there's any racism left in Hollywood, it's not, yes, there is color racism. Yes, there is sexism and all the other things. But to me, a lot of it is benefit of the doubt. It used to be that you would never get the benefit of the doubt that you could tell a story. So even if you look at something like Spider-Man, I remember early in my career, just being a superhero geek, wanting to, put myself up for a Spider-Man movie. And the first question you get asked as a writer is like, do you have any, writing or samples of writing in this genre? Which, of course, at the time, no one has it, unless you're literally coming from comic books. You don't have any samples of that. So my question back was like, okay, well, what part of, I watched Ordinary People, and I don't remember anybody in that movie doing anything superhero-like, And so Alvin Sargent, of course, he's a legend, but for using that criteria, how did Alvin Sargent qualify to write Spider-Man 2? And, what they don't want to say is, oh, well, if you're Black or if you're a woman, like, how can you relate to writing one of these movies? And people don't ask that question anymore, because, all those walls are being broken down. And, and I think hopefully that'll continue.
That's great, man. Yeah, I mean, it is like I said before, really the mainstream platform of storytelling now are these superhero stories, and that they have embraced not just sort of more innovative storytelling, at least, from a plot and character standpoint, which obviously, like we said, with viewer savviness, you sort of have to do, to keep, that's what, viewers want, but to let creators bring voices, bring representation onto a massive global platform and global scale. And also to your point that, people don't know what people want, because everyone's talking about, the Ted Lasso, everybody wants the uplifting thing, but the biggest show in the world is Squid Game, where they're just executing people left and right. So something that Salim said that I thought was really interesting was about there is something that is sort of about superpowers and having literal physical power over to dominate any situation that is almost inherently fascistic about having superpowers, which obviously is a perfect segue to Eric. And I would love to hear about how you came to The Boys, which obviously is just such an incredible comic, source to be writing from, which has a very aggressive voice and super bloody, and how you came to it and what sort of genre place you were coming from as you were breaking story, and what you sort of early on were like, these are the kind of stories that I want to tell through this show.
Yeah, and first, I'm a stone cold fan of every single person on this panel, so super psyched to be with all you guys. It's pretty awesome. But I came into it as like a huge fan of Garth Ennis, who, as the comic book author, deserves a lot of credit, all the credit for creating the world. I mean, we're all in a certain way like playing in other people's sandboxes, and so just that there's a whole other world of writers who are inventing all of this stuff that then we're turning into a different medium. So, obviously The Boys is different because The Boys is written as a satire, and trades on a deep understanding that the audience is going to have with superhero tropes. And it was written for comic book geeks who were taking the piss out of that. And so when we were translating it into film, like, you could have never made The Boys even 6 years ago. Like, you needed the world to be completely programmed, where the elevator pitch is like, oh, Marvel, but they're real, and like that, no one would have understood that pitch, even a few years ago. So, so we, I came at it, me and the other producers, we started actually in a fairly innocent place, because we were like, okay, we want to tell a satire, but we want it to be really grounded. So our true north was, let's take superheroes and let's put them as much as possible into the real world that we are all living in, and try to apply logic to what is inherently an illogical phenomenon, which is magical people flying around, right? And so that leads you down very particular paths. Once you start playing that game, you start saying like, all right, well, the speedster is a professional athlete because it's the only superpower that's performance-based. And like, if you're the second fastest man in the world, like, you're fucking out. You have to be the best. So that would be really stressful, and you would be like working, the Aquaman character in ours became like the pretty boy actor who wanted to direct, and he just couldn't understand why no one would take him seriously. And the Superman character was as you would be if you had true godlike powers in our particular world. If you were a human brain with godlike powers and not an alien, you would inevitably become sociopathic. You're just too disconnected from the humanity around you. And so it really just started with like, okay, let's play this game, and they would all be super celebrities. Seth Rogen's initial pitch when we would take it out was, he said, well, what if Robert Downey Jr. was Iron Man? that was the pitch. I thought that was amazing. And so it was about like applying then all of a sudden like all these super celebrity, this very inside industry thing. The movie that inspired me the most in writing it was Network. It was like I really wanted to be inside the world and be really biting and everything. So so that was where, and this was, by the way, like early 2000, mid 2016, and then this fucking guy ended up in the White House, right? And that's happening underneath us. And now suddenly I'm telling a story that happens to be, we started it to be like celebrities, but now suddenly it's a story about where authoritarianism and celebrity combine, and that intersection, and so we were like, I mean, the mantra in the room is bad for the world, good for the show, and believe me, I'd rather this not be the case, but we were handed this amazing trove of important material to start talking about misinformation and how people use celebrity to further authoritarian aims, and we started talking about all of it, and the writers had this sort of sense of, glee's the wrong word because we weren't happy about it, but like a sense of like, okay, we're going to dive into this as absolutely as deep as we can go, and try to tell a story that is up to the minute of the autocrats who are standing in front of everybody, cheering crowds, saying, you have to trust me because I'm the only one who can save you, when anyone who says that in reality is the last person who can fucking save you. And that the real people are humanity and your family and your brothers and sisters, and the million boring acts that people do all day. Like, that's how the world gets saved, right? And so, so then the last part we kind of added to it was, with that in mind, we said, everyone's going to know, because anyone who knows the comic knows that it's really subversive and bloody and violent and nudity and sex and the whole thing, right? And so I kept saying, the most surprising thing we could do, the most subversive thing we could do is be really emotional and make people really give a shit about these characters. They're going in expecting it's going to be some kind of sardonic, cynical, jerk off, and so to be able to go in and make these characters, make people actually shed it. My goal in really all of season 1 was like, I really want to make someone in the audience cry about one of these characters. That was my goal, because I'm like, because if I can do that, then they care about these insane characters in this insane universe. And somewhere in all that, in that stew, is the boys kind of emerge from.
Can you talk, I know obviously you can't say much, but can you talk a bit about the spinoff that's happening, just in terms of a genre angle? Because I know it will be more of like a school set piece, and how that, because there's so many incredible school set stories, and I mean, it's a genre within and of itself, and obviously it will exist in the same, like, tonally as the show, but I'd love to hear you speak to that.
Yeah. No, I mean, what's funny is like we came into this like completely satirical and satirical of just like, the notion of a conglomerate, with all, I love all your stuff, but like, and I love Marvel movies, but a conglomerate like Marvel, and then you cut to us a year later and Amazon's like, how can we expand your universe? And we were like, oh, okay, cool. I guess that's what we're doing. So but we had, it was the producers who came up with this one, and it's about a college where the kids in our universe who have superpowers, they're learning. It's not like that old movie Sky High. It's more like they're learning how to market themselves and choose their brands and manage social media. And then there's like Hunger Games style competition. But like ultimately, it's our take on a college sports show, because it's about, at the end of the year, there's a draft and people are chosen for cities, and there's an incredible amount of corruption, and there's an incredible amount of like throwing sex and drugs at people who are way too young to be able to handle that level of access. And so the thing we look at more than anything is like, we're studying like college scandals, sports scandals. That's kind of what we're trading in, and then putting a superhero spin on it. And, I mean, look, the thing I would say is, to answer the big question of like, what is superhero stuff? Like, any good genre is only good if it's a metaphor, right? Like, so, and this is the first superhero thing I've ever done, but like, I told a horror show, and that one was about family, it was about family as a horror movie. And the Boys is, everything I talked about in terms of its metaphor. So I think the reason, I would say all genre is really flexible. We could have the same panel about science fiction or horror or anything, because it's what that particular, like you heard it today, like it's the personal experience that each person puts into a fantastic element, and how does it reflect back into what's really happening in the world in their experience. And so so everything, really everything can be anything, if you have a particular point of view on it.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and what's to what you said, and also what's the case for pretty much everyone's work here in this superhero space is it's preposterous. It's just like a preposterous idea that, and yet you're all telling such intimate character stories. I mean, obviously, any film and television is only appreciable as an intimate character-driven story. I mean, I think what we've learned through some other superhero stories, not naming things, but that you can have very well-recognized characters that people have known for decades, but if you're not putting them in a intimate character-driven situation, and they're just flying around and smashing around, people aren't going to connect to it. They aren't going to be interested, and that's not. And I think you've all done a really amazing job of especially working in like you said, and Marvel's a massive entity, but still telling interesting, challenging, intimate, character-driven stories where what it is about is their personal journeys, traumas, overcoming those traumas. And then Michael, I think that everybody was, swooning over Loki based on where you took this character that people liked, but was kind of, a sort of side evil clown, and really went in deep and did the, before midnight treatment of, oh, what if we take the superhero and just they talked, and they're just talking. And I'd really love to hear same thing about when you came in. I mean, obviously when you pitched, when you came in, what kind of stuff you guys looked out for genre inspiration as you were breaking story and then writing episodes.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Also very stoked to be here. Yeah, that was our genre, was talking, was just dialogue. That would and that was just selfish on my part, because I love to write dialogue, and I felt like that was Loki's superpower. You want to watch Superman fly, I want to watch Loki, Tom Hiddleston, talk. And so the whole show, I thought of those long dialogue scenes as those were our big action set pieces. When I came in, like Jack was saying, there was a general idea of like, it's Loki in a time travel adventure with the TVA. And so it was up to me to give it some shape. And the first thing I said, it's a very reductive pitch, but it was, well, what if the Loki show was the best show anybody's ever seen in their life? And that was what I said to Kevin Feige, because there's a really low-hanging fruit version of this show that's just Loki on a horse with Paul Revere being like, the British aren't coming, and it's like, oh wow, they did it, and I was excited that that was kind of the expectation, that's what a show like this might be. And what I thought would in fact be really subversive was, you've got a character who's the bad guy of the first Avengers movie, arguably one of the most beloved characters in the Marvel canon at that time, played by a movie star who's a tremendous actor. And I was like, let's go as deep with this character as we possibly can. And all the scenes that you wish were in Marvel movies that just can't be because it's 2 hours and there's so much to service. Let's build our show around that. So really, I just wanted to rip off Mad Men, but make Loki Don Draper and explore why he was broken, and hold a mirror up to him. That just felt genuinely thrilling to me, and so. But I had to wrap that up, I guess, in a genre of its own, which became kind of a man on the run, conspiracy thriller, so to speak, of Loki, on the run from the time police, working with the TVA, and then ultimately bringing the whole conspiracy down. Which is crazy because I don't even really watch all those movies. I'm bad at that shit. So that's where my writer's room episode 2 of Loki was very procedural. That was our there's going to be a lot of police work in this episode. And my writing staff was amazing, really grinding through that. Cause I was like, I'm going to go work on this dialogue scene in the first episode. That's what I want to do. And so we built all that stuff together, but it was a lot of watching Silence of the Lambs, Zodiac, Catch Me If You Can, and stuff like that. And I think it was just tonally, there was something that all those things had in common because this is Loki coming off of, Ragnarok was the last big movie you'd seen him in, which was Ragnarok was funny. And I was coming off of Rick and Morty. And I think my first outline for the show was much more comedic. My first outline for episode 1 was much more comedic than the show ended up being. And I've never seen somebody yawn more than Kevin Feige did as I pitched the outline for that first episode. And I was like, oh shit. All right. If I don't get fired, I gotta course correct. And so then it was more, all right, let's look at Blade Runner 2049 and let's see if we can go to that place and let's really lean into this being a dramatic story. And I'm glad we did.
I'd love to hear you. Well, first, I'm obviously you can't talk about any specifics or details, but going into Doctor Strange, you did that after Loki, and then coming off of the first Strange movie, which did have sort of that Derrickson horror sort of aspect to it. You can't answer this question at all, Ken.
I mean, I can talk about it. I mean, I don't know. Talk about it a little bit. It's nobody's going to talk about it. It's the WGA. It's all this is Circle of Trust.
That's right. It's a union. It's protected.
I mean, what I can say is Sam Raimi's directing this movie, and so Sam and I came on to this one at the same time, and then because of COVID, we had a chance to kind of really start over on it and say, all right, what do we want our version of this movie to be? Sam is a master of horror, obviously, but really what he's a master of is character. And he references Alvin Sargent a lot, and he tells, he's always looks at me. He's like, Michael, I don't think Alvin Sargent would say this is an honest scene. And it's like, that's the most cutting you get. But when you do good, it's like Alvin Sargent would be proud of this. And then it's like, oh, wow. And so, with that, the interesting thing I guess I can say working with Sam is he's never looking backward. It's never like, I want to make sure we're making a Sam Raimi movie. It's like, I want to make sure we're making a Doctor Strange movie. And I want these characters to inform the choices that we're making, and you know, and the tonal decisions and all of that. And so I don't know if that's an answer, but I don't think I'm going to get fired for what I said.
Not an answer. And just something else I want to ask you about is Rick and Morty, which itself is like the entire show is just subverting tropes. It's just like, okay, what's trope? Like, let's Rick it up, you know, like, I would love to hear you sort of talk about that, you know, working, you know, with Harmon and Royland, and how you guys would subvert those. I mean, each episode is its own, you know, sort of like, now we're doing this take, now we're doing, like, you know, the medium of Rick and Morty, and then how you sort of, you know, brought that with you, or I guess did not.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I came up under Dan Harmon, and so he was a mentor of mine, and I was lucky to get to learn from him. Yes, Rick and Morty is constantly, as like Community before it with Dan, is constantly subverting things, but subversion on its own is certainly not enough. If you're just doing that, then all you're going to do is just disappear up your own ass, and eventually it's going to feel like you're making fun of the audience for watching your show. And I feel like something that, you know, Dan, when we work on Rick and Morty, the most important story that you're breaking in the episode is the emotional story, is the very simple family sitcom, classic, 3-act structure story. That's what Dan cares about. He doesn't care about, we're going to burn through 8 sci-fi concepts an episode that I'm always mad I pitched, because I'm like, shit, I could have written a spec about that. Why did I waste it? It's going to be 5 minutes in this episode. But what Dan's much more excited about is, well, how are Morty and Summer's relationship, how does that evolving in high school, and the pressures of social circles and everything. And so, you know, I learned early on from Dan that no matter how heightened you go, all that really matters is again, just that character journey at the heart of your story. That's the important thing. And then, if that's locked into place, then great. Then you can really be bold and take chances with the other stuff, because it's going to feel fun. But if the emotional scaffolding isn't there and the audience isn't invested, then you know, a bunch of subversion is not going to do all that much for you.
Can you do me a favor and define disappearing up your own ass? Because I got kind of lost in that moment.
How would I describe that? I guess it's you get so excited about your own clever ideas about how to take the piss out of something that you cease to tell a story, and so your head crawls up your own ass. If I had a whiteboard, I could I'll DM it.
Yeah, no whiteboard needed. Thank you.
This is great. One thing that I did want to just go around and asking you guys is, you know, this is for the Guild, we're all writers, and Jack, you sort of did answer this already, but what are the genres you fell in love with as a kid, as an early reader, as a watcher of movies, that made you, and what are the genres that either was the first thing you tried to write, or that inspired you to be like, I want to speak through this voice? I mean, that's really what the genre is I can speak through this tone. And anybody want to jump in? We can. Dave, I've chosen you.
Wow. You'd think after 18 months, I would have figured out how to use this program. Thanks for choosing me first, Elliott. I appreciate it. I grew up in the 80s in a household that did not value Western media, essentially. We had a TV, but no cable. I was not very aware of popular media mostly. And so my first interaction with movies was when I was old enough to go to friends' houses. And then I saw Predator. So that shaped it continues to shape a lot of my personality and my interests. Basically after that, it was, open door to Stallone and Schwarzenegger and Van Damme and all that kind of stuff. So I have a real soft spot in my heart for that. It is not what I came out here to write, unfortunately, because I ended up writing a bunch of that kind of stuff. And but eventually I went from that to, then I spent about 10 years just watching pro wrestling and didn't watch anything in college because I was being stupid. And then I came to Hollywood to write comedy. And I came here I'm in LA. I came here in 1999, the summer that American Pie came out. So I decided I was going to write gross out comedy. So I wrote a lot of really vulgar, disgusting, stupid scripts about people fucking strange things. And then I pivoted really hard into thrillers and like action movies because too much information. I had a really bad breakup. I was really depressed. I was angry. And for the first time in my life, I decided to actually try to put what I was feeling into my writing. And I used it as therapy, and I channeled sort of my hurt and my trauma into a script that I don't actually think structurally was very good, but my suspicion is that it reeked of reality, of like somebody really upset and in a bad place wrote this. So that's the genre that I broke in with. And then luckily I managed to slow roll out of that, because the truth is, like, writing really dark material is rough, because I'm primarily a feature writer. So I'm by myself doing this most of the time. And I hate it. I don't know why I chose this job. I'm generally a pretty gregarious person. So it's hard enough to be alone and to feel lonely and not have people to bounce ideas off of. So when I'm doing that and I'm thinking dark thoughts and I'm thinking of nihilistic things, or watching or researching things that are just dark sides of the world, it's too much for me. It got to be too much for me pretty early in my career, and now that I have a family, it's just a non-starter for me. So I intentionally aimed to head into a more action comedy direction. I essentially a marriage of the things I fell in love with to begin with, and luckily I was doing that right when all movies turned into action comedies. Essentially, I mean, even the Marvel movies I think are basically comedies now. So worked out.
It did work out. You got to burn those gross out scripts, though. I tell you,
Yeah,
like those hard drives. Get canceled hard. Cheo. How about you? Early genre influences. I know that obviously your influences you were looking at, like, on on the news and stuff, and but same
well,
deal.
I mean, for me, it's like I kind of grew up, like, I don't know if you guys ever watched Joe Bob Briggs, like, like I guess if you wanted to put on my genre, like I grew up watching those like genre movies in addition to, loving gangster movies, and then also spy thrillers, everything from like 3 Days of the Condor to Spy Hard. Like anything in between. I've always loved music, so and I've always liked how, particularly, the films of Spike Lee and how he uses music. Oliver Stone. I mean, like a lot of different things. Like I've got a lot of different influences, and so one of the things I love about writing is the ability and the opportunity to take as many things that you're influenced by and then try to put it through the prism of you and seeing how you can make it fit in whatever situation you're in. One of the things that my uncle taught me about screenwriting is essentially, the structure is the coat hanger and the story is the coat. And you basically, you're just using, you wouldn't use the same hanger for a heavy coat that you would for a nightgown. So you're just constantly using, you're making whatever structure fit whatever the story needs to be. And so like, I think that the real trick is just slipping into different voices. And, I learned how to write certain things by writing other things. What I mean by that is like, I didn't really know how to write anything funny until I started writing, a drama like Southland. Because when you hang around homicide detectives, all they do is basically, stand over bodies and tell jokes because they don't want to really absorb the horror of what they're witnessing on a daily basis. And so that's why I've got a theory that basically comedians make the best homicide detectives, because that's really what they're like, is like they just like they get to the point where they can eat a sandwich over a body and just kind of talk about things, it's funny. Everyone, you go to any screenwriting class and everyone will talk about Citizen Kane and some of the classic movies. And my thing is like, you really can learn more about writing from the Long Tall Sally sequence in Predator, because I go back to that sequence constantly, because how do you make the audience care about 8 people in a chopper? How do you differentiate all their personalities with single lines of dialogue and this one guy telling a really vulgar joke and the reactions to it? So by the time they land, you actually care about the people that are going to get killed in these gruesome ways over the next 35, 40 minutes. Hopefully I haven't spoiled the movie for anybody. Or even like the come together sequence of Armageddon. Like I always love, you can find different things in different movies and then use them differently with whatever you're writing, So I think it's all applicable. I mean, I think what's so great about film as a medium is that it allows you to learn about other people and other cultures and just other ways of life without ever having to leave or go anywhere. I mean, like the thing that really helped me with Luke Cage, where some people would say, well, is it too black? Is it too this? I said, look, I don't know shit about heroin or Scotland, but I know that when I watched Trainspotting, that movie took me somewhere else. And so even though the show was going to be this deep dive into Black culture and hip hop culture, I wanted the audience to understand that even if you don't understand every single thing that you're hearing or being said, it's a buoyant environment. If you just relax, you'll float. And, and I think, the best movies do that. They find a universality, like, because when you see a world and you hear the world, you're going to suspend belief and then just go with it, which is why it's like, it's funny, like even something like The Sopranos, like that show hits you differently, like depending on your age. So when I first watched the show, when it first was out, all I cared about was who's Tony going to, who's going to get killed this week? Like who's going to get whacked, And then all of a sudden it's like, at 48, I'm watching the show and it's like, all of a sudden, all the things happening with AJ and Meadow are fascinating. And, as a father and all of a sudden, Tony going through his midlife crisis, having been through one of my own, it's like, shit, this is like, I understand why all the critics went crazy over the show, because half the critics were the same age as David Chase when they're writing about the show, so they could identify with all the themes that were happening in terms of that thing that I completely missed as a kid. And movies are the same way. And I think even with comic book movies, like, if somebody asked, like, are comic book movies going to last? And you have to understand an entire new generation of filmmaker has been raised on these movies. And so they don't look down on the genre at all. And so they're going to perpetuate different versions of these stories, no matter what you call it 20, 30 years from now,
Yeah, that's great, man. And I think that it is still too soon to spoil Predator. So, spoiler alert for anyone watching. Eric, same question. Early genre influences that made you want to be a writer, that first kind of stuff you wrote. You mentioned writing horror also, obviously.
Yeah. it's funny. It's really, really similar to what Dave set out to do, which is like, I grew up, I was a kid of the 80s, and for me it was comedies. I was sure I was going to be a comedy writer, and the things that I loved were like Animal House and Fletch and Blues Brothers and all of that. And so I came out here to write around that exact same time. Like it was gross out comedies, and then you're forgetting like bad Adam Sandler knockoffs of just like Man Baby. They should have all been called Man Baby. And I was writing them, and it turns out it's like I wanted to do it since I was 10, and like I came out here to do it, and then it turns out I sucked at it. And then like I just could not write a good comedy to save my fucking life. And I was just like, oh my God, what am I gonna do? And then I started paying attention to like this sort of thing I didn't pay attention to the first time, which is, like when you ask Mike, like how much I broke down Sam Raimi movies, and how important Evil Dead 2 was to me, and how important like Peter Jackson's Dead Alive was to me, and all of these particular filmmakers who were all making horror. And so I decided, like, you know what, I'm just going to write a horror script just to blow off steam and just to try the genre that I loved, actually. And I named every victim after a studio executive, every single one, and just kind of put it on a shelf. And then a friend of mine, I mean, it's funny. It's like a friend of mine showed it to someone who showed it to Sam, and then 3 months later, it was in production as their first Ghost House movie. And now suddenly I'm a horror writer, and then got to Supernatural from that directly. So you just kind of ride where it goes. And I'll say this, like, I'm way happier writing like science fiction or superheroes or horror that's unexpectedly funny than to have to be a comedy writer. Like, I'm just terrified by the amount of jokes per page, Michael, like you have to put in a Rick and Morty. Like, that's horrifying to me. But if you can have another genre and then unexpectedly have one good line, then suddenly people are like, oh, you're so great, your shit's so funny. And you're like, not really. I just put in one good joke in every 7 pages. So I'm much happier where I landed, for sure.
Yeah, it's it is so interesting about how I'm sure that everyone has experienced, and a lot of people watching this have experienced as well, how much it really is about like, no, you have to be this thing, like you're this thing, and you're like, yeah, but I'm not that thing, and they're like, but the people willing to employ you want, and you're like, yeah, I'm that thing, that's totally my thing. Salim, same deal, early inspiration, early genre stuff you fell in love with, made you want to write?
I think for me it was a few people. It was Gordon Parks. I just loved his range, and Gordon Parks Jr. as well. I think also John Cassavetes and was a huge influence on me, because John Cassavetes' movies always felt like I was just dropping into somebody's world. They seemed more like documentaries than movies to me, and that's just me. It was just like the rawness and the way that he presented his films to me was amazing, and I really enjoyed it. And to be honest with you, Parliament, Funkadelic, their stories around their music really influenced me in terms of comics and the fantastical world that you could live in, because that's what they presented. And if you really listen to those albums in sequence, you will go on a journey. John Sayles was a huge influence on me as well. Again, just the rawness of his movies really captured me. Like, I never felt like I was watching entertainment. I always felt like I was watching something that was really real. And I think lastly, Johnny Carson. I watched Johnny Carson every night. And right after that, The Honeymooners. I mean, that really had a huge influence on how I saw the world. They were places, people use the word now, a safe place, safe place. Those were safe places that I felt like I could go and watch. But Gordon Parks has always been sort of the premier influence on how to approach a story in a subtle way that that communicated to your people. Because here's the thing, I see my art as, and I hope you all see, because I do see it. When I look at what you do, I see it as art. He always presented his art in a way that communicated to his people.
He lost his audio.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we got you now.
Yeah, Gordon Parks always presented his art in a way that was very specific to his people, but universal in its themes.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I strive to do. So those guys were my early influences. And as a young Black man, they say you never want to meet your heroes. And so I don't do a lot of research about, Johnny Carson or Jackie Gleason or Ed Norton or anybody, because, I was a big fan of Elvis until I heard that he was a fucking racist. So, I try to avoid doing much research on my heroes, because they, at certain times, they can let you down. But I would say the main influence on my storytelling came from my mother, because she was such a great storyteller. And she was so lovely. And so, I mean, my mother would go to prison and come out, and it would never be like a sad thing when she got out. Of course, it would be happy. But what I mean by this is that she would have some of the most great stories about being in prison. and we would sit around and we would laugh about it, and then I would sleep on the edge of the bed, because back then, you had to wait up super late to watch Johnny Carson or The Honeymooners. And she was an amazing storyteller. Mm-hmm. And so I would listen to her tell her stories, and some of them were very factual and steeped in the reality of what she had been through. And some of them were amazing. Like, she would tell me, Sly Stone was your babysitter, or I was on the bus with James Brown, and he stopped the bus in the middle of nowhere and put somebody off the bus with a wad of money because they had marijuana on them, and he was very strict about people and drugs. Or she would tell me stories about, being on the bus with Ike Turner and him coming back there and her cussing him out, saying, "Fuck you, Ike. You can do that shit to Tina, but you ain't gonna do it to me. I'll fuck you up." So my inspiration came from a lot of different places, not in one particular stream of consciousness. But what I can tell you is that all of it came back to storytelling. We had a family of storytellers. You know, the story that they told me about how I got beat up by a monkey when I was little. You know, all these things become a part of you. And she would always say to me, you know, young man, your life is a little bit different than most. It's a little bit rougher. Your mom is in and out of prison. You don't really know where your father is, but these things are going to allow you to tell stories and do things that most people won't be able to do. So it's actually a blessing and a gift. And so I always looked at it that way.
That's incredible. Michael, tough act to follow. Early genre inspirations made you want to write. Did you want to do comedy?
Top Gun. It was just, that's it. That's my answer. Truly, I guess that was the first movie my mom showed me. My mom would keep me out of school all the time and take me to the movies. Seeing Armageddon together was seminal. It's actually, my wife's going to be shocked that I wasn't the first one to mention Armageddon on this panel. It's probably the first time that's happened. But yeah, Top Gun. I don't know. That was my favorite movie as a kid. Still is. What was the impact that had? I guess it's just that was such a big blockbuster, tough movie that in the center of it, the main character loses his best friend and weeps over him. And there's so much emotion. That movie, I was like, oh, it's okay to cry. like because Maverick cried when Goose died. And I guess I just always think about that's a movie that is a great action movie that, God, it made me feel so much, at least as a little kid. And there's really genuine human emotion wrapped up in that. And so yeah, that was a big influence on me. And then if you've heard of Star Wars, those were, and all that stuff, you know, all the videotapes that every kid wears out. And then I guess as I got older, discovering, you know, the films of Richard Linklater, Paul Thomas Anderson, people to me that were really such great artists with dialogue and with weird, odd dialogue and who weren't afraid to digress and everything. That was hugely influential for me.
Awesome. Yeah, me as well. As a young, watching like Top Gun. My dad didn't watch a lot of movies, but like he would watch Top Gun, and we watched it like, I don't know, 3,000 times. Jack, I know you mentioned it a little bit just about, you know, Ripley and female action stars, but I'd love to hear more about what was the first sort of thing that made you want to write? What was that? And how do you feel about like this moment now? Like, where do you really, because there are these female-led action stories being told, but, you know, how do you really feel about it? Characters being represented and just your whole, elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, I when I was really little, I loved fantasy stuff, and I like, you know, Dark Crystal and Labyrinth and that kind of thing. And I think Neverending Story, this is so cheesy. I'm like, I'm going to talk about kids movies. But I like that, the idea that story was like, oh, it's a story within a story. And then I'm part of the story, and it's all like the lid is just blown off, which it was a little bit like WandaVision. I think that like those kinds of stories early on kind of set my hair on fire or blew my hair back, whatever the expression is. And I Yeah, I mean, it's really exciting, the state of things. I mean, it's like, what's really great is I don't get asked on panels as much about like, hey, what do you think about female superheroes? Because they're just like a shit ton of them now, as well. There should be, and I think what I think is wonderful is like, is it across all sort of media. If we're going to talk specifically about women, is just that like. That they're complicated, that they're multidimensional, and that is the victory. That the story isn't, hey, look, she's got a uterus. It's, you know, that she is a person, and that she can be defined. The pronoun she can be defined in many ways. So that's what I'm excited about. And I agree. I can't remember which of the distinguished panelists said this, but that like it's no good unless the genre of the superhero story is a lens through which to examine something else. And so with Wanda especially, I relish the opportunity to. It was about, obviously it was about her grief, duh. But it was also about her stepping into her power, and she got to ride that whole journey herself without anybody coming in with like a big assist or a big, like, I'm going to stab you because you're too powerful kind of a moment. So yeah, I feel very optimistic and excited, and I'm really excited to see there's so much content that's coming, not just from Marvel, yes, from Marvel, but from everybody. And all the lights in my office have gone out, which is spooky. So anyway, the ghosts are coming, and someone send help.
Someone sends us a message. This was really great. Yes, it is such an exciting time, and especially because all of the work that you have all been doing is just incredible. And I'm obviously not alone in feeling that way. Thank you all for being here and joining us for this conversation. It's been fantastic. Thank you to the Writers Guild. And yeah, thanks a lot, everyone. Take care. Have a good night.
Thank you.